In the United States, we often hear how polarized we are between our political parties. But I think that we are polarized based on another characterization. Our main divide today is not Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, but those who affirm civilizational values and those who don't. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a Julie Noted news video or a Timeless episode. And also be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. Now we're dealing with a pretty light subject today. It's a pretty heavy subject, but nevertheless extremely important. And that is, what are civilizational values? And how are they being undermined today in the United States? As I indicated in the introduction, I have had an epiphany with regard to the main distinction that we are seeing politically in this country. Viewing life this way has provided me with such clarity, and obviously I want to share that with you. But first, I'd like to walk you through my thought process of coming to this conclusion. That is that the main distinction today is not so much conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, but those who affirm civilizational versus anti-civilizational values. It all started with this question that I have been pondering for some years now. How is it that 60 years ago, we used to agree on so much that nowadays we are debating? If you think about it, again, 60 years ago, Democrats and Republicans actually didn't differ on very many things compared to now. Nearly all Americans, for instance, used to agree that you fly the American flag on the 4th of July, that you love and appreciate the United States of America and all that it has done for us and for people around the world by setting such a good example of an imperfect country who has over time improved and lived up to a great moral standard. People used to totally agree on that, whether you were Democrat or Republican. We used to agree that there are two genders. That has seemed to change, to put it lightly. We used to agree that you must follow the law, and if you don't follow the law, then you deserve to be punished. That seems to be contested today. We used to all agree that more police generally means that your neighborhoods in your society would be safer. We used to agree that minors ought not to make certain decisions that adults make, principally when it involves their bodies, especially mutilating or surgically altering their bodies. And finally, there are so many other examples, but I'm just listing some of the most salient ones. We used to agree that, like buying alcohol or buying cigarettes or flying on an airplane, you should have an ID to be able to vote. All of those things now are contested. Those are values that I would like to call civilizational values. Civilizational values, the whole point of the episode is to give you more of a definition, so I'll be fleshing it out over the next few minutes. But these are values that award the highest level of freedom, dignity, and prosperity for all members of the population. Democrats and Republicans, if we're thinking about a Venn diagram, used to have a huge center on which they agreed. And these values that I just listed were in that center. And then on the outside, Democrats and Republicans disagreed about truly liberal or conservative things. That is, whether or not to raise or lower taxes, whether to pursue an interventionist or isolationist foreign policy, whether to have fewer or more gun restrictions, whether to have a regulated or free market. Those were the things that people used to debate about. Even if you look back in 1960, the first televised presidential debate was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. They are actually talking about details more than civilizational basics. They're talking about taxes and foreign policy. They're not debating over whether there are two genders. But oh, how things have changed. We are no longer talking as much about the details. Of course, we still, debate about guns and debate about the economy. But mainly, the positions of the Democrat and Republican parties are on these civilizational values. Look at the battle, for instance, that is being waged between red states and blue states over this so-called gender-affirming care issue. I would argue that this has become one of the top 3 biggest issues that Democrats and Republicans disagree on. Of course, Republicans think that it is ludicrous and even criminal to allow people as young as 10, 11, 12, or 13 years old to mutilate their healthy breast tissue and genital tissue in the name of, again, so-called gender-affirming care. And Democrats are on the other side saying that no, youngsters ought to be able to do that. And it is bigoted for people to think that they shouldn't be able to do that. So we have states, for instance, like Tennessee, Texas, and Florida that are passing laws saying, no, until you are 18 years old, you are not allowed to mutilate your body. And then we have states like California and Washington, which recently passed statutes which characterize parents in custody battles as abusive if they do not affirm their child's gender. Just for clarification's sake, this law was passed by the House of Representatives here in California. It is yet to be approved by the Senate and by the governor, though those are all Democrat majority institutions, so it will probably be passed. But in the state of Washington, the law was passed by both parts of Congress and approved by the governor, which again which characterizes parents as abusive if they don't affirm their child's gender. That isn't a liberal or conservative, progressive or principles of the American founding issue. That is a civilizational versus non-civilizational issue. That is something that 60 years ago, people on both sides of the aisle would have been shocked to think that we would even be questioning and debating over today. Another really especially salient example is this battle over free speech. 60 years ago, all of us agreed that free speech is a basic, non-political, civilizational value. Now we have Michigan State passing a law in their House of Representatives, which is pending approval from the state Senate and from the governor, which would actually make it a felony, finable up to $10,000 for an individual to not use the preferred pronouns of another person. That is a blatant attack on free speech. The reason why I vote Republican overwhelmingly as opposed to Democrat is that I believe that overall, the GOP is trying to defend those civilizational values. In my judgment, the Republican Party is just trying to keep the same, the things that we used to agree on, and the Democratic Party is trying to present an alternative. And interestingly, I don't think a lot of Democrats would actually disagree with that characterization that I gave. A lot of Democrats would say, yeah, you're right. We are trying to change what we once understood as civilizational values because Western civilization is defective. Western civilization is bigoted. It is rooted in homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, white supremacist ideologies. So you're right. The things that we used to think were good in our new enlightened state in 2023, we think are bad. So it's just interesting that now we have people who are actually trying to go against civilizational values, and they're not even hiding it. They are proudly, openly doing so. The reason why I like characterizing people and their views as either affirming civilizational values or not is because I actually think that transcends party lines. As I said, yes, I tend to vote Republican. I tend to agree far more with Republicans than Democrats because overall, I think Republicans are trying to affirm these civilizational values. But let's take someone like RFK Jr., who's running for president as a Democrat. Even though he's a Democrat, I really agree with him on a lot of things. I actually agree with RFK Jr. on more things than I do with some Republicans, because RFK Jr., despite being a Democrat, affirms civilizational values. He is pro-free speech. He is anti-government censorship. He believes in healthcare choices, that you have the right to decide whether or not you get a vaccine. He believes that we shouldn't defund the police. I agree with RFK Jr., who's a Democrat, more than I do, unfortunately, as much as I hate to say it, with someone like Mitt Romney, who I used to really admire, but now, since he ran for president in 2012, he's gone to all of these F the police, Black Lives Matter protests and posted pictures on Instagram with him in those protests. this awful group that does nothing for Black people, that actually makes things worse for Black people by defunding the police, taking police out of certain neighborhoods, not giving money where it should be being allocated, like bail funds in public schools. So again, I like dividing this between those who affirm civilizational values and those who don't. Now, before we go on to what are civilizational values, a more fleshed out analysis, I'll pause for a moment and say that some people may say to me, Julie, you fool, some of the things you talk about aren't civilizational values. They're Western civilization values. Other civilizations have other values that we ought to respect. This is the whole kind of moral relativist argument that we see has become really in vogue in the United States, where some people have other values and we should just respect that. Many places have civilizations in terms of infrastructure, public works, government, and economy, tax systems, etc. But not all civilizations in their entirety have civilizational values. What has made the United States so great is that the United States is a civilization as far as the tangibles. We have public works, we have taxes, etc. But we also, alongside that, affirm civilizational values, treating people with dignity and respect, giving people liberty, regardless of their background or standing in life. That is not true of other civilizations. Half of the countries in Africa, Africa has 54 countries. Did you know that half of the 54 countries actually criminalize homosexuality? And a handful of those countries not only criminalize homosexuality, but make it punishable with the death penalty. Are you telling me that that is a civilizational value? To persecute and kill people for being gay? Let's take Iran as another example. Iran has a law that says that the age of criminal responsibility for women is 6 years younger than the age of criminal responsibility for men. Additionally, in Iran, if you are a woman, you have to ask for your husband or father's permission to obtain an education, to work. If you are accusing someone of rape, which happens so often, it's just terrible in Iran to women. If you are accusing someone of raping you, you just can't go to court and fight for yourself. You, according to the law, need 2 male witnesses to corroborate your story in order for you to even get a court date. Are you telling me that that blatant misogynistic persecution of women is a civilizational value? Are you telling me in China when they kill people for even speaking out against the regime, are you telling me that's a civilizational value? Are you telling me that the Uyghur massacre that's occurring in Northeast China is a civilizational value? Some of these countries that I mentioned in some ways do have civilizational values. For instance, in Iran, there are laws against stealing. That's a civilizational value. But there are many other values that many of those countries have that are not civilizational. As I said a few moments ago, what has made the United States so great is that in addition to building a civilization, we have overwhelmingly built civilizational values. But the whole point of this episode is to say that I fear that that is reversing. I fear that we are becoming much like other places in the world where we are affirming anti-civilizational values. So let's dive in. What are civilizational values? I want to explain where we get them from, because in order to really appreciate their utility and their worth, we have to understand where they came from. And then, of course, I will provide some examples of how they are being undermined. Well, of course, our civilizational values here in the United States come from the Bible. They come from Judeo-Christian values. That is not a Bible-thumping or super religious argument to make. That is as obvious as saying the sun is hot or that bees collect honey. It is just true. And what's interesting, too, about biblical values, I've always found this to kind of be a fascinating paradox. Biblical values are both super biblical and not biblical at all. In that the 10 Commandments, for instance, yes, they are biblical in that they were handed down by God, but they're also kind of a-religious because the rule, do not murder, do not steal, that should apply to everyone, regardless of religion. So that's the great thing about Judeo-Christian values. They are applicable to everyone, whether or not you subscribe to Judaism or Christianity as your religion. There are 4 civilizational Judeo-Christian values that I want to identify for you and show you how they are being subverted. The first one, arguably the most foundational one of all, is that we are all equal as human beings, and our ties to one another as human beings is greater than any other identity that we have. More than your gender, more than your race, more than your religion. This, of course, comes from the idea that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. This is said in the early chapters of Genesis. And so in the Bible, what is immediately established is that God judges us as human beings because we are all created in his image and likeness. He doesn't judge us, again, on race, on our gender, on even our religion, interestingly. He just judges us according to our shared humanity. Jesus, for instance, in the New Testament, he never said, I can't preach to this person, or this teaching of mine isn't relevant to this particular group. He assigned no importance to what group someone was in. His teachings are applicable to everyone. And in fact, in the Bible, there are so many instances where Christ will go and he'll, talk to the sick, he'll talk to the disabled, he'll talk to concubines, he'll talk to members of a different religion. And that is deliberately to show that we all are equal in the eyes of God and that we have a shared filial human connection to one another. So that's the origin of our value in the United States, that we have a filial human connection to fellow citizens. That comes from the Bible, and that has been affirmed in the United States by, among other things, our national credo, e pluribus unum, out of many one. That means out of many ethnicities, many backgrounds, many religions, we are one American people. You can see the line between the biblical value and then the American civilizational value that has been established. Sadly, though, we are seeing this being turned right on its head. Instead of affirming that our greatest connection to one another is as human beings, in the United States, we are now consuming a cultural diet which says that no, your greatest connection to a person is if they are your same gender, or if they are your same race, or if they are your same sexual orientation. We are being sliced and diced into different subgroups, and those subgroups are increasingly becoming pitted against each other. This is where you walk down the street and you see BLM flags all over your neighborhood, or pride flags on the front of stores or hotels or restaurants or even art galleries. I was in New York City recently, and walking down the street, there was a woman that was wearing a shirt that said Proud AAPI, which means Asian American Pacific Islander. We characterize people, again, based on their demographic or political identities, and that is coarsening our filial ties to one another as human beings. There is this idea that you shouldn't, on the left, that you shouldn't interact with conservatives. You shouldn't even give credence to their arguments because they are horrible bigots. That is an assault on the civilizational value that we always have something in common with one another, despite the ways that we're different, because we are all human beings. We gravely underestimate the danger in diminishing this common humanity. If you look at the vast majority of other countries in the world, different subgroups absolutely hate each other, and it tears these countries apart. For instance, many countries in the Middle East, if you are an ethnic minority, for instance, the Kurds in Iran, because Iran is a primarily Persian country, or the Persians in Iraq, because Iraq is a primarily Kurdish country, you are persecuted. There is so much in-group fighting between Kurds and Persians and Arabs and Alawites and Sunnis and Shias. That is the whole basis of the Syrian civil war. It was this conflict between different religious groups. If you go over to India, Muslims and Hindus in India absolutely loathe each other. They see nothing in common with one another. There is so much ethnic strife between Muslims and Hindus, and also the Sufi population, where actually there is these secessionist movements where Muslims in India and Sufis in India want to create their own countries and break away from India because there is so much conflict. We in the United States have come to a remarkable accomplishment because we have facilitated the most diverse, peacefully coexistent society ever. Have race relations always been perfect in the United States? Of course not. But in the United States, if you walk into an elevator and you are in the elevator alone with someone of a different race, you don't even think about it. You don't have a reason to get mad at that person. If you are in the Muslim Middle East and you are a Sunni and walk into an elevator and there is a Shia there, not good news. It is because of our civilizational value that we all have ties to one another as human beings over anything else that has kept such a remarkably peaceful society. And the more that we separate into these different identity groups, we are getting further and further away from that. So that is civilizational Judeo-Christian value numero uno. There are 4 that I'm telling you about. Number 2, and these are all connected, is that because we are equal, there are certain universal moral rules that apply to all of us equally. Again, all of our values come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. If I could synopsize the Bible in 1 second, it would be that God shows different circumstances. He shows, even in the first few chapters of Genesis, he shows a flood. He shows Abraham's wife not being able to bear children. He shows brotherly strife. Cain kills Abel. He shows humans' proclivity to do wrong in the Adam and Eve story. He shows prostitution with Abraham taking a concubine in order to bear children. All throughout the Bible, there are so many situations that are just of the human condition, and he applies the same moral rules and standards to each situation. He shows that individuals, regardless of their circumstance or background, are to be judged the same way and are to be held to certain standards that are applied to everyone equally. So just as God applies certain moral codes like the 10 Commandments to all of us equally, we in the United States have developed the civilizational value of setting certain laws that we also apply to our citizens equally. For instance, do not steal, do not murder, do not shoplift. Pedophilia is not okay. I mean, there are many, many laws that we have established. But we are increasingly living in a society where, first of all, people reject that there are any universal moral rules, and B, people reject that they ought to be enforced equally. There's a large contingent of the United States that no longer believes that you should be told not to steal. I mean, we see this in LA, in San Francisco, in New York City, in Chicago, and many other Democrat-run cities, where people walk into CVS or walk into another drugstore or supermarket or clothing store, and they literally just take things off the rack, put it in their backpack, and walk out. And the police can do absolutely nothing about it because it happens so often and it has become so accepted. And it goes to this idea that there aren't universal moral truths. Some people may have to steal in order to feed their family, and we should lend respect and credence to that idea. Some people should be allowed to steal because they are part of a racial minority group that has not been treated well in the past. That is fundamentally anti-civilizational. We need to set certain rules that are applied to everyone equally. But increasingly, rules are being applied to people based on their group identity. Let's take illegal immigrants, for example. There used to be a rule that you needed to be a citizen to live in the United States, and you needed to be a taxpayer in order to have access to certain public services. Right now, that rule is being broken specifically for illegal immigrants. This is the example of rules that are not being applied to everyone equally. They are applied differently based on what group you're in. We see in New York City, for instance, and in Chicago, that, to take New York City, for example, Mayor Eric Adams is actually making certain religious groups, certain churches and synagogues, open their doors so that illegal immigrants can be housed there. Eric Adams is providing subsidized hotel residency for illegal immigrants who come there, subsidized food, subsidized healthcare, subsidized education. All of us can feel sympathy for illegal immigrants. If I were in a country where I was persecuted, of course I would want to come here and give my children every opportunity that they can. But it is fundamentally anti-civilizational to break the established rules according to whatever group that individual falls into. Let's take the homeless, for example. I live in Los Angeles. There are homeless encampments almost everywhere. They are on sidewalks in front of people's places of business, in front of their homes. I had a friend actually recently who was walking by a homeless encampment in front of her apartment, and a homeless guy started throwing things at her. And she yelled at him and said, "I'm going to call the police. You have to stop doing this." And you know what the homeless guy said to her? He said, "Call the police. They're not going to do anything." That's the idea. The rules don't apply to me. I'm homeless. They're not going to be able to do anything about it, and they are going to subject me to different rules than they otherwise would. Again, of course, I have enormous sympathy for people who are homeless. It's a very difficult life to live, especially when our cities are not providing the right kind of support to these individuals. But we cannot unravel a civilizational value that you are not allowed to camp out in front of someone's home. We cannot unravel a civilizational value that you are allowed to throw things at people because you have had a hard lot in life. That is, at its core, anti-civilizational. Let's go on to civilizational value numero 3. The first one is, as a reminder, the first one is that we all have ties to one another as human beings that transcend our group, ethnic, religious ties. That is being subverted. The second one is that there are universal moral truths that apply to everyone and should be enforced to everyone equally. Civilizational value number 3, as I said, they're all related, is that there are certain objective truths, period. In addition to certain objective moral rules, there are certain objective things that are true. This comes, unshockingly, from the Bible. In Genesis, these rules are immediately established in the first 3 chapters. God declares land from water, human beings from animals, men from women, good from evil. These distinctions, these true things, are bedrocks of a civilization. You need to agree on what is real and what is true in order to build a life. Well, nowadays, there's no such thing as men and women. You can just make up your gender. There's no such thing as that objective truth. You can be a cow. You can identify as a furry or a cat or a frog. You can deny that you're a human being. No such thing as that objective truth. We've also unraveled the objective truth that some things, like calling people the N-word, are racist, and other things, such as calling a black person articulate, is not racist. In this bizarre, anti-civilizational, confused world, we think that calling a black person articulate is a microaggression and is fundamentally racist because it is somehow implying that black people aren't articulate. I mean, it is just an outlandish, crazy way of thinking. But at its root, it is denying that certain truths exist. I'll give you a final example. Did you know that according to the Oregon Department of Education, finding one right answer in math is white supremacy? Truth is not truth anymore. Up is down, left is right, good is evil, evil is good, bigotry is not bigotry, and tolerance is bigotry. It's all confused. And I know I've said it a million times, we should play a drinking game, but I cannot hammer it home enough. It is fundamentally anti-civilizational. And finally, arguably one of the biggest civilizational values that has contributed to the success of the West, that has set the West apart in terms of the dignity, freedom, and prosperity that it has provided to its citizens, is the value of merit. In the Bible, God values one thing above all when he is judging people. That is their moral merit. Noah, for instance, I think it is Genesis chapter 6 or 7, when God is destroying the earth because there are so many evil people. He wants to start humanity over. He saves one person and his family, Noah. Want to know God's justification for saving Noah? He says that Noah was, quote, the most righteous man on earth. He didn't say, well, Noah's a man, or Noah is an aggrieved minority, or Noah has brown hair, and that's why I'm going to save him. No, he judges Noah on his moral merit. Noah set himself apart from others by being righteous. He deserves to be on the ark and being saved from the rest of the catastrophe. If you look at Moses, who is probably the most important figure in the Bible, second to God. Moses is the person who on Mount Sinai reveals the 10 Commandments, God's moral prescription for everyone. Moses had a stutter. Moses, the man who revealed the moral will of God, had a stutter. But that didn't matter. God judged him on his merit, on his moral merit. He knew that Moses was a righteous person, and so that's why God identified Moses as the conveyor of his values. So just as God rewards moral merit in the Bible, we, the United States, being a Judeo-Christian country, have taken that example, have taken that moral truth. And we have decided to reward people not only based on their moral merit, but on their academic merit, on their prowess, on their work ethic. That is so important. And that is a value that is uniquely, I shouldn't actually say uniquely, I should say most especially promulgated in Western civilization. I recently read a book on Islam. Those of you who watch the show know I did Islam 101 and Islam 101 Part 2 episodes, which I encourage you all to watch. It's just fascinating to understand the tenets of a religion that a quarter of the world follows. But my point is, Bernard Lewis in this book that I read was talking about the differences in values between Western civilization and Eastern civilization. And he said, in the Muslim world, nepotism is seen as a moral virtue. Nepotism, of course, here in the United States isn't. For those who don't know what nepotism is, it is rewarding your family members when you get in a position of power. In the Muslim world, if you become a head of government or if you become a head of a company and you don't use your position to reward your family members, then you are considered a really bad person who doesn't protect your own. That is a Muslim value. In the United States, we don't reward people based on our familial ties. We reward people based on their merit. It is wrong in the United States, in our cultural view, to reward people just because you're their family member. Because you ought to judge people based on what they have proven to you. And that is the most egalitarian system of all, because it strips away all of the other subjective, or not subjective, all the other ties that you can't control, uncontrollable ties. You can't control your gender, you can't control what family you were born into, you can't control your race, you can't control what religion you were born into. And by rewarding merit, we strip all of those things away and we just judge that person based on their prowess. Well, not so much anymore here in the United States. Let's look at DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. That is arguably one of the biggest wars on merit. I have a friend, I can't say which financial institution she works at, but let's just put it this way. It's a pretty well-known financial institution, and she is on the hiring committee where she interviews applicants who want to work at this financial institution. You know what she told me? She actually wasn't allowed to say this. This is not public. The institution has not come out with this. But she said that there is a rule that you cannot ask minority applicants technical financial questions because A, they may not know the answer. This is according to this financial institution that has set this rule. And B, it can be seen as racist. Need I say more about the war on merit? Affirmative action is a war on merit. That in order to get into a certain college, you need a certain, GPA, a certain test score, but not if you happened to be born as a racial or sexual minority. Checking boxes, in any case, is a war on merit. Pass-fail is a war on merit. Eliminating the SAT or the ACT or the LSAT, as many top colleges and universities are doing, is a war on merit. Saying that you can't characterize William Shakespeare as a really great author. This idea that you can't say that some works of literature are better than others, that is a war on merit. The University of Pennsylvania, in their English department building, actually removed a portrait of Shakespeare and replaced it with a portrait of a Black lesbian poet. Why? This is according to UPenn. because, quote, Shakespeare does not represent diversity. As I said at the beginning of the episode, we are seeing people are not shy about going against civilizational values. They aren't denying that they no longer care about merit and they only care about skin color. That's the scary thing. So finally, now that I have told you the 4 main civilizational values and how they are being undermined, I will say this. If anything that I have told you today resonates with you, you have a responsibility to practice it yourself and talk to other people about it. I know it sounds corny. I know it sounds trite. I know it sounds proselytizing. But we have all been the beneficiaries of civilizational values. We practice civilizational values without even realizing that we practice it. There are so many that I didn't even mention. For instance, the value of the nuclear family. That comes from the Bible. That has been a cultural virtue that we have affirmed and tried to incentivize with government institutions like marriage. Those who grow up in 2-parent households have so much more of a likelihood to succeed economically, to go to college, to stay out of trouble, to stay out of prison. And most people who decry the nuclear family, who say that it is an antiquated, oppressive, old idea, actually grew up in 2-parent households. We are all the beneficiaries of these values that people for hundreds of years have worked to build so that we may live in a good society. So all of us have a responsibility to others and to ourselves to promulgate them now and going forward. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope that this was clarifying and interesting to you. You can always write into me at julie@julie-hartman.com. I just love hearing from viewers, and I will see you all soon on Timeless. Take care.